Good afternoon. We will be talking during the next hour, and I hope it stays within this hour, about JavaScript, the programming language. And since it's always a good idea to explain a programming language by example, I will draw some examples from the Google Maps API. Okay. So as I said, I'm going to talk about JavaScript, the programming language. And yesterday I explained this new architecture of web applications called Ajax, which is actually not so new, but the name is very new, and therefore it was still worth to talk about it. And a central thing in this web applications as we build them today is a scripting language, and this scripting language happens to be JavaScript. And besides being very important for web applications nowadays, it is also a very nice programming language which is not very widely appreciated though. So the central issue of this talk today is basically to explain JavaScript and to explain why it is much nicer than people usually think. And originally I thought that I can kind of teach you JavaScript in an hour, but while preparing this talk, I discovered that it is actually impossible. I mean, you all know that things should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So and it turns out that teaching JavaScript as a whole within 1 hour would make things simpler than possible. So still, I try to give you an introduction or an overview of JavaScript, how it feels as a programming language, and basically give you pointers if you are interested in learning JavaScript or in applying JavaScript, where to read more or learn more about the language. And I hope that I can convey kind of atmospherically what JavaScript is about, because it is very quirksome somehow, because it is mostly implemented in very weird runtime environments. Okay, I get into some detail later. And a central issue also is, I think, to lose respect of all the difficulties that surround JavaScript and cross-browser web application development and all that. Okay, so much for that. JavaScript, as I said, has a very bad reputation as being not a serious programming language. Mostly because of the name, because if you look at JavaScript in some detail, it turns out very quickly that JavaScript has nothing to do whatsoever with Java. However, I mentioned yesterday that JavaScript was originally developed not to replace Java as a programming language, but to actually bind Java applets together within a web page. So it was originally developed to script Java and not to replace or to be a script version of Java, which makes much more sense and makes the name being much less ridiculous than it sounds. However, it is actually a quite nifty programming language, which has something like custom objects, function objects, functors. You can create closures, that is, you can create functions dynamically and as closures. You have a much richer literal syntax than Java has, and so on. So on, it has been called a Lisp with C syntax, which is quite right, actually. Google Maps, on the other hand, so the main source for the examples that I'm going to display or to show later, is very widely known as well, I believe. It was launched in the beginning of this year, at the same time, coincidentally, as I happened to start working on it. So when I contributed some of the features that are visible on the Google Maps website. So as I said, it launched in February, later was complemented by satellite images in addition to the maps, and merged with the local search property of Google. And by now you can search for businesses, at least in the US and in Canada, on the map and get these displays on the map. And it is widely considered to be the prototypical Ajax application, although this is not literally true actually, because this Ajax stuff is around for a little while. And if you only look at Google, then at least Gmail is also an Ajax application and around for a whole year more, actually. Just to give you an example, in case you haven't seen it yet, This is how Google Maps looks like. You have this map here, and the nice thing, or the very neat thing, is that everything happens within the page. So you can grab the page, and you can move it around and zoom in or zoom out. And this, by the way, is where we are right now in Berlin, near the Alexanderplatz, in this conference center here, which is right here. So much. Oh yeah, and this website, in addition to be the website with this nifty, nice embedded map, also has an API, which means that it is possible to embed this map that we have seen on Google's own website, this map here in the middle of the page, in arbitrary other web pages, which is quite useful actually. So everybody who talks about something that makes sense to be put on a map can now just include a map in his web page and show things that are interesting on a map. So for instance, here New York recently was exposed to a strike of the subway, and it was quite nice because nobody could get in or out of the city. And here's a map that explains how to actually get around in the city and which streets are still open for traffic, which happen to have been not that many, and so on. So this is the map included, or the Google map embedded in a page of the New York Times. And all these additional things here on the map, so these lines and icons and whatever, those are put on this map using this API. So that's what the API is about. So you can embed maps and put things on the map. And in the next half an hour, I'm going to explain how that works. Okay. Let's start to look at the syntax of a typical JavaScript program. Here again is an example using a Google Map, and that's the simplest possible application of this JavaScript API, right? That's an empty web page, and it just contains this map without anything else except the possibility to drag it around. So here's the Alexanderplatz, here's the television tower, and so on. So now I'm going to show you how this looks like. Okay. Several things to note. So first of all, JavaScript looks pretty much like Java and C++. So it really makes sense to just describe the syntax in difference to Java and C++. So what you see here are the first thing, or the most important thing, is JavaScript is usually embedded in HTML pages. So it is not, as many other programming languages, you don't run JavaScript by itself, at least as far as web applications are concerned, but instead you embed it in an HTML page. And this JavaScript that is embedded in the HTML page is executed while this HTML page is loaded. And what you here see is the JavaScript is contained in the content of this script element. So there's an element in HTML that is called script, and the content of this element is meant to be a JavaScript text that is executed as this element is being read. This text, or this JavaScript code fragment makes this map appear on the page. So what we are doing is we have this div element that is called ID equals map, that has a width and a height, 800 pixels by 400 pixels. And what we are doing is we are creating a Google map around, or that fills itself into this element. And we can do this because we include a JavaScript file right up in the head that comes from the Google Maps website, and that contains basically all the library code that is necessary to do this Google Maps stuff. Okay, and this library exports some objects to us. So JavaScript, of course, is object-oriented. Everything is an object. And what we can do with these objects is, first of all, creating them, and then calling methods on them, setting properties on them. Yeah, that's basically it. And that's exactly what we are doing. So The next thing to note is actually that there some objects are provided by the host environment. So this JavaScript runs in a web browser that contains a web page, and this web browser provides some objects to the execution environment of this JavaScript. So, and one or the most important of these objects is the document. So here's the document. This document is also an object that has a method called getElementById, and this method takes an argument called, well, in this case has the value map. That's the ID of this element. So we get a handle of the JavaScript representation of this div element in the HTML. I mentioned yesterday that the API to talk to an HTML document that is provided in JavaScript is called the document object model, or rather it is a document object model, so it is an object-oriented API to a document format. And in this case, it is the document object model for HTML. So when I mentioned yesterday that the API is quite cumbersome at times. So, but getElementById is a reasonable, well, yeah, kind of a reasonable name, although I would prefer to have it shorter. Anyway, so this gets us a node, a document object model node that represents this div, and this div we pass to the constructor of this Gmap object. And this Gmap object is the Google Map object, basically the object that manages all this behavior, that you can drag it around, that there are map tiles loaded into the div, and many more things, which we see later. It has some methods, and one method is to set the map type. You will see later that the Google Map has different map types, or I actually mentioned that already. So you have a map that looks like a map, and then you have these satellite images, and we don't happen to have maps for Berlin yet. So, and because I want to show this map with Berlin, with the current location actually, it doesn't make sense to show the map mode of the map, which is the default mode, and therefore I set the map type to the satellite map, which shows the satellite images. And I do that using this method setMapType, and this is a predefined constant that I just pass as an argument. The next thing is I create something that represents a geographic location, which is an object of the class gPoint. And these are our geographic locations right now. So that's latitude, and no, that's longitude, and that's latitude. So, and then this map has nicely this method center and zoom, and I just pass the location of the center to the map, and I pass a zoom level. So something that is quite arbitrary, and I just say zoom level 0 is the highest possible zoom level, that is I'm as close as possible. So, and that's it. And that's so much for a very brief overview of JavaScript syntax. So you can look at some of the text that looks pretty much like Java or C++. And to give you a bird's eye overview of JavaScript syntax. So you have seen something like we have control flow statements. They look exactly like C and C++. So we have if, we have for, we have while, we have switch. What you haven't seen is we also have exceptions. That is, you can do the usual exception handling with a try block and a catch clause, and you can throw exceptions that will be caught by the catch clause. We have blocks, that is sequences of statements that are contained in curly braces. We can call functions, and in order to call functions, we use these parentheses, and in parentheses we pass argument lists that are separated by commata. We can deal with objects, and in order to deal with objects, we have particularly this new operator that allows us to create new objects. And also, as we will see later, we have a this keyword that is used inside methods to access the object we are currently executing upon. And we can access members of these objects using the dot operator, which I wrote down here. And later we will see that we also have these brackets that also allow object access, property access on objects. And we can build expressions. So we have these arithmetic operators and Boolean operators, and we have the unary arithmetic operators and the ternary operator and so on. So that all looks pretty much like C++ and Java. So we have here these C++ and Java comments, and statements are separated by a semicolon, which is very nice, except actually, or anecdotically, that you can omit the semicolon in JavaScript. I explained that yesterday, that JavaScript was invented at the time when Netscape, where it was invented, competed directly with Microsoft, and Microsoft had this Visual Basic Script, and in Visual Basic Script, statements are terminated by the new line. So in order to, I don't know, my interpretation is that in order to tease people who are used to Visual Basic Script to use JavaScript as well, they built in this possibility to omit the semicolon at the end of the line, or at the end of the statement if it coincides with the end of the line. That creates endless hassle, and is not a good idea, but it's still in the language. So much for that. The differences are mostly in semantics. So while it looks syntactically much like Java or like C++, it is semantically quite different. And the most notable difference is that it has a top-level flow of control. That's what I pointed out. So when JavaScript is being read, that is embedded in an HTML page, it is executed while it is being read, completely in difference to C++ or Java, where there is no top-level flow of control. So we have an arbitrary entrance point of a flow of control, which is the main function in C++, or the main method, which is a static method in Java, but there is no flow of control going on in the source code that's being written. So, and in that respect, JavaScript is, of course, very much like other scripting languages, like Perl, Python, and shell scripts, and so on. And I also mentioned that it is usually embedded in other types of documents. In this case, notably in HTML. But I still want to point out that actually other document types have document object models as well. And they very often also happen to use JavaScript as their scripting language. So for instance, PDF has a document object model and can embed JavaScript, and Shockwave can embed JavaScript where it is called ActionScript, and so on. Anyway, in this case, it is HTML in which this JavaScript is embedded. And that actually creates, funnily, all kinds of conflicts because HTML has a very strict syntax, which is different from the JavaScript syntax, and it is possible to write JavaScript text down that it is illegal to be contained in HTML. So for instance, these angle brackets or so, which are less than and greater than operators in Java, are not allowed in HTML text, actually. Yet JavaScript appears where normally text appears, so and that creates conflicts which are very tedious and cumbersome actually to work around. Other things that we have not yet seen, but will see shortly, are so-called prototypes. So I just talked about creating classes or creating objects and instantiating classes. However, it turns out that there's actually no such thing as classes in JavaScript. And the alternative is called delegation and prototypes. So we delegate method invocations to prototype objects, which are just objects, and these prototype objects act like classes, which is very interesting and very nifty. So I'll get to that shortly. I also mentioned closures and dynamic functions, and well, as in scripting languages, as usual in scripting languages, we have an eval operator, which is also very useful. Back to this embedding of JavaScript in HTML. So I just want to demonstrate where else in HTML JavaScript can be embedded. So first of all, well, we have seen two occasions actually in the first example, so that where files that are referred to by the source attribute of the script element. So that was the first thing that we have seen, this JavaScript library that we include from the Google host. So that's JavaScript that is in an external file that is loaded using the source attribute. So then JavaScript can be contained in the content of the script element that we also have seen. That was basically the script fragment that we have seen. And the next thing I'm going to demonstrate you in a next example. This is again a Google map as we've seen it here. But now we have these two links here, down here on the page, which say zoom out, zoom in. And if I click those, then I can zoom out or zoom in. And I'm going to show you how I achieved that in the source code. Okay, and here are actually two differences from the example that we have seen before. The first difference is that now we are defining a function that contains all our initialization code for this map. So, and I explained that this code that is contained in the script element is executed while it is being read. And yesterday, if you have heard this talk about Ajax, I explained that this is actually a wrong thing to do. Because what we are doing there is we access the document object model of this document while it is not yet complete. And this is actually undefined, and you're very lucky if you do this and it works. And in fact, if you, for instance, if we would have done this inside a table in Internet Explorer, it wouldn't have worked. And Internet Explorer wouldn't have told us what's wrong, only that it doesn't work. So in general, it is actually completely undefined what happens if you access the document object model of a document that is not yet read. And therefore, it is better to actually wait until the document is completely read. And the way to achieve that is using this onload event. In general, whatever happens in an interactive application happens as reaction to events. So if you have a graphical or a user interface application or an application with a user interface, then everything that happens in this application basically happens as reaction to an event that is created by the framework using which this application is written. And one of these events that also occur in HTML, so because the HTML document is, so to speak, the framework of our application, one of these events is load, or the load event. And this event is fired or occurs, the lingo for that is it is fired, when the document is completely loaded. So, and what happens now in the script element is that we merely define a function. So, and the script is still executed while it is being read, but what is executed is this function definition. So we have now this function load map, and that does exactly what the script did before directly. So, and this just defines a function. So now we have here this other place. So I'm still talking about places in HTML where JavaScript is embedded, remember? So, and here's this place, an onload, or an attribute of the body element called onload, and that is defined to contain JavaScript text that is evaluated when this load event is fired. So, and this is just a function call. So the function is called loadmap, and it is invoked using this call operator. So, and what happens now is that this function over there is called when a document is completely being loaded. That is, we can really meaningfully access the entire document object model of this document. Okay, so that's the third place where JavaScript can occur in HTML. A fourth place is so-called JavaScript URLs, which you see here. And that's actually also a very cumbersome idea when JavaScript was invented. Somehow people wanted to execute JavaScript when they click links. So, and a very straightforward and brute force kind of way of achieving this was to define JavaScript as a protocol for URLs. So you know that URLs start with something before a colon, something like HTTP, for instance, or FTP, or mail2, or whatever, and they just defined JavaScript, colon, as a protocol for, or to be used in URLs. And what this means is that whatever follows the colon is a JavaScript expression that is executed in the context of the document that contains this link, but no navigation takes actually place. So this just executes this JavaScript statement. So, and what happens here is if I click on one of these links, then I call the method zoom2 on this object map, and I pass a value to this method that is actually a zoom level, which we have seen before, and this method happens to have another, or this object happens to have another method that gets the current zoom level, or that gets back the current zoom level. So, and what I just do is I zoom to one zoom level up or one zoom level below. So that's zoom out, that's zoom in. So one level more or less. The thing is that these JavaScript expressions are executed in the global context. So that is, yeah, they are executed not inside a function or something, but in the global context of this document, or in the global scope of this document. And now in order to call methods on my map object, I have to retain a reference or to obtain a reference to this map object so that I can call methods on it. And if you look up there, this is what I've done there. So I have this global, I've declared this global variable map and initialized it to null, which is just nothing. And when my onload handler was called, this load map function, at this point I changed the value of this map object to my newly created map object. So and this actually also makes this code wrong in a certain sense. Namely, if I click on this link before the document is fully loaded, then this expression evaluates or doesn't evaluate, because I try to invoke a method on null, which doesn't work because there is no such method yet. Yeah, question.
I have a short question on this onload function, because I had tested it. I had some strange difficulties with different content types of the HTML file. When I set it to HTML 3 something, it was executed, and when I changed the content type to HTML, the onload function wasn't executed. Mm-hmm. And Firefox and Internet Explorer, is there something?
No, nothing that comes to mind immediately. You just have to investigate that. But that's just the spirit of programming JavaScript. Yeah. Okay, so much for that. To conclude, okay, I mentioned these 4 places basically where JavaScript can occur in HTML. And just to complete that, JavaScript URLs can really occur wherever URLs can occur. So, and that is meaningfully, of course, only in the href attribute of an A element or in the submit attribute of a form element. However, at least also the img element has an attribute that has a value that is a URL, which is the source attribute. And at least in Internet Explorer, if you put a JavaScript URL in the source attribute of an img element, then this JavaScript is executed, which is not meaningfully at all. So it's really a bug, but that happens. And a 5th place where JavaScript can occur in HTML and related documents are CSS behaviors, but only in Internet Explorer. Yet behaviors are actually a nifty concept, and that's why I mentioned them here. So if you like to read into that, that will be very nice. And next thing, you've seen already how we've defined functions. And I just mentioned that this way of invoking functions in a JavaScript URL that is just put into this link is actually wrong because it doesn't always work. So if I click the link too early, then my JavaScript breaks. So now I have an example where I corrected this. And by the way, I got rid of this global variable, which is also not very nice to have actually. So you should all know that global variables are evil, and you should have pointed out that to me earlier. So now, let me explain what happens here. We've seen already this load event that is fired on the body element in HTML. Now I'm going to use another event, which is the click event. And what I'm doing now to install my zoom out, zoom in functionality on these 2 links